Good afternoon. My name is Paul Edison-Lahm. This is the Reed College Architecture Tour. This is now the third year, or going on the third year, where we haven't been able to meet in person. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked to put together a short video, and it's about 4 minutes long. So we're going to start by watching that and then jump into the presentation. The choice of architecture can say a lot about an institution. So it's actually a little surprising that here at Reed College, with its focus on the humanities, you won't find a single classical column or Roman arch. Instead, the buildings here are in a style called Collegiate Gothic. Triangular false gables, low-slung Tudor arches, and castle-like crenellations. So why this choice of medieval and Elizabethan styles for buildings built at the beginning of the 20th century, here in a former cow pasture in the middle of the Portland Basin? There are at least two ways to tell the story of this college, which owes its founding to Oregon settlers Simeon and Amanda Reed and the land which proved so hospitable to them. The Portland Basin, where they made their home and fortune, had previously been filled by three catastrophic floods from the east, each of which followed the path of the Columbia River. One of fire, the Columbia River basalts, 16 million years ago, a river of lava which flowed through the Cascades to the sea, leaving the tremendous basalts of our magnificent Columbia Gorge. One of rock and ice, the Great Ice Age floods which poured through the Cascades of the Columbia Gorge, flooding the entire Willamette Valley and Portland Basin to a height of 400 feet, as witnessed by the Kalapuya people as recently as 12,000 years ago, and leaving the massive sand and gravel deposits that the college rests securely on today. And finally, one of Euro-American settlers in the 19th century, who again poured through the Columbia Gorge, aided in good part by Simeon Reed and partner William Ladd's efficient monopolization of the Oregon Steam and Navigation Company, which is how the Reed fortune was made. One of those settlers was the Unitarian minister and progressive reformer Thomas Lamb Eliot, who, with the aid of the Unitarian Ladies Sewing Society, helped found the Boys and Girls Aid Society, the Ladies Relief Society, the Library Humane Society, Parks Commission, and Art Museum. Eliot influenced the Reeds, especially Amanda Reed, to bequest much of the Reed fortune for an institution of learning for the promotion of practical knowledge, literature, science, and art. The land for the college had been, for at least the 12,000 years since the last of the Ice Age floods, within the traditional lands of the Clackamas-Qualiwalla people, one of the over 30 tribes that were forcibly marched by the U.S. government to reservation, which was further chipped away at and then terminated, and finally restored in 1983 as the sovereign Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Back in 1850, in order to further extinguish Native American title, the United States passed the Donation Land Claims Act, assigning plots of up to 1 square mile to white men and their wives, plots which were bought up cheaply by the enterprising Ladd, also a banker and real estate developer. The Ladd Estate Company donated the initial 40 acres of pasture land to the Reed Institute, in part because of the historic connection between the two men, and in part to burnish the prestige of its racially segregated suburb Eastmoreland to the south, purporting to protect Reed from being surrounded by low-class dwellings. Eliot chose Reed's first president, the young and idealistic progressive William T. Foster, who wanted to break from confining Ivy League traditions that emphasized sports and fraternities, and had a sweeping agenda that included confronting social ills such as high medical costs and false medical advertising, the conspiracy of silence in matters of sex, silly motion pictures, injustice to the unemployed, billboards on the Columbia River Highway, intercollegiate athletics, and the chaos and waste of English spelling. In the very mortar of the college, in this distinctive wide-jointed brickwork, you can find the geological evidence of the two great floods of basalt and gravel, and in the architecture, in this beautiful Tudor Revival detailing and hand-carved limestone, the contradictions of history. I hope you'll come back for the completion of this video, when we'll look more closely at some of the fantastic architectural details and also some unexpected history of these somewhat problematic, complicated, and, to me, beautiful and inspiring buildings. So we'll have some revisions to that history, or at least some additions that have come up in the nearly 2 years since we made that video. We hope again to be meeting in person by next year. That would be nice. There's something to standing in front of the buildings and having those moments of just sort of quiet contemplation and observation to really appreciate the details. But all of this started about 6 years ago with this man, Eric Wheeler, who runs Positively Portland Walking Tours, an architectural historian. And I was taking one of his tours of East Moreland. We were cutting across campus, and we were walking by the library with its, castle-like library with all of its carvings and so forth. And he said, that's actually a Pietro Belluschi building. That's where this all started for me, because Belluschi, if you know Portland, is our premier modernist architect. He's famous for sort of austere modern buildings and some groundbreaking buildings, like the Equitable building downtown, built in 1948, which was the first aluminum-clad, entirely all-enclosed HVAC services, air conditioning and heating and so forth. Breathtaking in its day, kind of a little bit average these days, or maybe a great example of sort of mid-century modernism. But that the idea that Belluschi had been working on a building, he also did the US Bank building downtown, Big Pink, but the idea that he'd been working on a building that had these grotesques, these limestone grotesques around it, kind of got my imagination going. Yeah. And so we started doing the research that led to this presentation. There are basically 4 styles of architecture over the last 110 years. And what you'll see is that certain forms, certain themes, and certain shapes, triangles and rectangles, reoccur. Starting with collegiate Gothic, that's the first style. And Gothic, to quote Woodrow Wilson, at its use at Princeton University, he noted that it added 1,000 years to the history of the university and pointed every man's imagination to the earliest era of learning in the English-speaking race. Well, it's not uncommon that universities want to burnish their presence by a sense of connection to history and tradition, and that's appropriate. What he means by the English-speaking race, we're going to return to a little later. Gothic is this vertical, this 10th, 11th century Northern European style. Think the verticality of Chartres and Notre Dame, the flying buttresses and ornate tracery of rose windows, and especially for us, this pointy arch. That's not the right architectural term, but this two-centered arch is the way it's described on a drafting table. That's the arch that reoccurs throughout Gothic architecture. But that's not quite what we have at Reed College, where it's more, it's sort of a pastiche style, more Tudor than Gothic, which I'll explain. So Old Dornblock, Eliot Hall, the old library, the Hauser Library, all of those are in the style that we call collegiate Gothic. What are the features that actually come more from Tudor, from the Elizabethan period, than anything back as far as the 11th century? False gables. They're false because a gable is really designed to hold up a roof line, and those gables are more a false front. They have this very distinctive triangular shape with the 2 little Corby stops or crow stops on each side. Tudor arches, this wide arch that's a 4-centered arch. And once you see those, you will see them everywhere in the old buildings, in the windows and other features and other ornament. And finally, those crenellations on the top of the building. Now, in Elizabethan times, those would have been defensive battlements. I guess you put your archers up there or something, and you would have had to have special dispensation from the sovereign to put them there. Although I think in Elizabethan times, they were even then still more ornamental than anything. So Foster and Eliot chose A.E. Doyle, a prominent architect at the time, who was already working in quite a variety of styles, including a sort of Beaux-Arts style. We have the Myron Frank or Macy's building downtown, the Central Library, and so forth. So he was quite adaptable to the style that Foster and Eliot chose. Doyle chose as his sort of fundamental palette this nice combination of brick, mortar, and limestone. Now, all colleges have brick, but Reed's is special. I'll tell you why. First of all, we have this nice English bond, this combination of stretchers and headers that adds some variety. And then distinctively, we have these wide jointed mortaring to get a little more space between the bricks and to sort of balance out the red with the mortar color. Doyle had the masons put gravel in the joints. So instead of the usual sort of 1/4 inch mortaring, you've got the 7/8 inch mortar. I made a big deal in the video of, that you can find pebbles that represent the 2 catastrophic floods of from Oregon geological history. If you're interested in that, come tomorrow at 2 o'clock to the Geology of Reed College presentation that we'll be doing again on Zoom. It's this nice combination of the roughness of the brick with the Salem limestone, this Mississippian age limestone, that's very common for civic buildings. And it's lovely because it catches the light in so many different ways. It has that rough texture. All of this stuff is hand carved. I mean, none of it is manufactured. It's all was hand carved by mostly Italian immigrant stone carvers that were brought in, and there was a shed set up outside of Elliott Hall, and there was a spur brought from the Union Pacific Railroad line. So they brought the limestone blocks in. It all looks, I mean, from this picture, it all looks like it was hand done, very fine work. And some of it quite mysterious. I mean, there's some symbolism in there. Some of it's obvious, and I'll talk about that. And some of it is maybe known only to the stone cutters themselves. These are buildings that want to convince you that they're made of stone. What you're seeing here are called quoins, Quoins, and they're ways of connecting 2 walls in a stone wall. And so they would be necessary if this were a stone building, but actually it's a reinforced concrete. That was the corner of Elliott Hall. Actually kind of advanced for its period in 1912. All these were built between February and September of 1912, both Old Dornblock and Elliott Hall. If you want a building that is exactly what it says of, shorn of all of this bourgeois ornament, go no further than MacNaughton Dorm. This is modernism. This is exactly what it says it is. It's concrete slabs, it's aluminum panels, it's glass with aluminum framing. There is a little brick on it, so it ties in that way. But basically, MacNaughton is exactly what MacNaughton purports to be, and you can quote me on that. The dormitories, the old dorm blocks, the plans were taken from Princeton and Penn. And you can find, I think, an argument that in the eccentricity of the dorms and the grotesques and the other features, like there's a beaver of Oregon, and there's the knocks and looks on either side of the Sally Port representing the day and night life of students, that there's some respect given for the autonomous, independent intellectual life of the student. But as in all buildings in an institution, there are countervailing forces. And so I don't know if any of you played Tomb Raider in the 1990s. But if you did, you know that Lara Croft is an aristocratic English woman who has this mansion that she practices her jumps and rolls at the beginning of the game. You get your skills there. And at the time, in grad school playing it, I thought, well, it kind of looks familiar to me. I guess this is just a standard style of architecture. The clue came from Gay Walker in the archives, who found this postcard to President Foster sent in about 1912 from Compton Wynyates in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. This is an Elizabethan era manor that has a very distinctive gate. And indeed, when we compare the two, you see that Compton Wynyates was not only the model for the Tomb Raider gate, it turns out, because I looked on Wikipedia, but also the model for our Sally Port. So the false gable, the crenellations, the sundial, the triple windows, this crisscross patterning in the brick, it's called diapering. Of course, the Tudor arch, but instead of the griffin of Henry VIII and the portcullis of the Tudors and the roses of Catherine Aragon, I might have gotten those switched. We have the griffin of Nouveau Riche Simeon Reed, and the griffin of Simeon Reed, and the griffin of Simeon Reed repeated over and over again. If you want to know more about the symbolism, Beatrice Olson has a lovely essay. It's in the library called Beneath the Green Tiles. It's kind of the first work about the architecture of Reed College. And but in any event, here we have, on this otherwise sort of democratic institution or building, or that's for students, we have a testament to basically Portland aristocracy. But, you know, there are always these tensions between sort of liberal progressive forces and traditional forces in any institution, especially any university. So it's all hand carved. Really look at this stuff in different light, because the limestone, I also do a downtown building stone tour with the Geological Society, and it's really made me appreciate both. You can watch on YouTube the videos of folks carving this stuff. It's beautiful workmanship, and it's beautiful architecturally because of the way it captures light, the way it ages over time. Again, some of the symbolism obvious. The griffin, Beatrice Olson has a little more to say about that. The roses, I guess, are City of Portland roses. The stars represent Amanda Reed's connection to the presidential Adamses in her hometown of Abington. Dorm's named after it, Abington, Massachusetts. So there are lots of ways to read that there are lots of, and there's some things we just don't know what they mean. Eliot Hall, which was originally the administration hall before being named after Eliot in the 30s, was based on St. John's College in Oxford. Also Stanford and University of Chicago to a certain extent. Remember, Foster especially wanted to distinguish Reed from the traditions of East Coast Ivy Leagues. But all around Eliot Hall, we have all of the shields, all of the emblems of all of the Ivy Leagues. So right in front of Eliot, we have Dartmouth, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and Penn, Columbia. And that's another sort of, I don't know if it's an irony, but it's tension. It's whatever it is. It's right there, and it's interesting. And you can go around and kind of try to figure out which one is which. The only place you'll find a Gothic arch in that early architecture, because it's Tudor arches everywhere except for the chapel, which makes sense because there's an association in some architectural circles of the Gothic with Northern European Christendom. And so even though Foster didn't want Reed to have to be a sectarian, they wanted a non-sectarian approach to religion, but they still felt religion had a place in the college. So here we have the sort of nested Gothic arches that you might see at Chartres, and those skinny Gothic columns that have little octagonal caps. And if you go into the chapel, which has this medieval heavy beam across the top there, wood framing and the wooden pews and so forth, you'd be hard pressed to find any explicit Christian symbolism. In fact, I'd be curious if anyone who has a better sense of architectural history could find some. But it's, again, the effort is to have a centrality of religion and in the college, but yet a non-sectarian approach. So Doyle dies young in 1928 of Bright's disease, and his protege, an Italian immigrant, Pietro Belluschi. Okay, now that's a picture of Belluschi when he's older, and anyway, Belluschi's been very influenced by modernism, by the Bauhaus movement and so forth. So he's ready and eager to apply what you saw a little bit earlier with some of those more austere modern buildings. At the time, he's working on some stuff downtown. This is from the Pacific Power Building. It's an Art Deco homage to the first electric powered transmission in this side of the Mississippi here in the Willamette Valley. He went on to do the Portland Art Museum, which was such a break from those traditional sort of neoclassical styles that the city fathers were going to vote it down. And the story is Belluschi had to reach out to Frank Lloyd Wright to say, look, this is the future. You're in the 20th century. So Hauser Library was already on the drawing board for in the Doyle firm. So Belluschi worked with the existing plans and with Reed College. And according to one historian, he hated it. You can imagine how retrograde and sort of artificial this sort of might have seemed to someone for whom modernism carried not only just sort of opportunities in terms of architectural exploration, but there were certain social values that are being represented by the older styles and the new styles. And so these clustered octagonal Gothic columns, or the vaulted ceilings here and this used to be the front entrance to the library, and it was filled with smokers and dogs and so forth. Now it has more sort of museum-like quality. But you see there the vaulted ceilings, and then the coffered ceilings, the wooden ceilings below in the larger part of the room. And there's these pendants that seem to suggest that there might be flying buttresses going out from the building. I love this building. To me, it is kind of a secular cathedral. And I mean, that's very much to my taste. And it's a lovely space. Again, it has a more sort of museum-like feeling than it used to when it was more heavily trafficked. Beluski did go on, though, and this is a tour we took with Tony Beluski, Pietro's son, a few years ago. And this is Zion Lutheran Church in Southwest Portland. It's an example of Northwest regional architecture, which is an effort, among other things, to use wood, natural wood, and to bring the light, the limited light that we get here in the Pacific Northwest, especially on these gray days, to bring light from outside inside. And it's a truly reverential space if you ever have an opportunity. So not only is it this combination of Northwest architecture, but you can see that he's working with the Gothic idiom there. He's kind of taken the Gothic arch and he's modernized it a little bit, and with that wood bracing on the side. So that does take us toward modernism, the rectangle, and that does start. Well, Beluski's first work comes to read literally on a truck after World War II. From these were buildings for the Bagley Downs Housing Project for GIs in Vancouver, Washington. Reed bought them on the cheap after the war, trucked them over, and then these buildings served variously as the ceramic building, ceramic studio, and the bookstore, and the faculty office building, and were successively truncated over the years, and remain in its rump form as what's now tongue firmly in cheek called the Graywood building, because it's got gray wood. And that's our first real, Beluski's work. But the first real modernist piece is what was the chemistry building and is now the psychology building. And this is a radical departure, obviously, from the previous collegiate Gothic. The only thing really it has in common is the brickwork. Other than that, I mean, to me, it looks like any elementary school that you might find in the United States in the mid-century. And it was kind of a building built on the cheap, which is a common story running through this presentation. Built on the cheap, not great materials. When it was a chemistry building, it was poorly ventilated and it smelled of chemicals all the time. It's been refurbished as psychology, and it does a much better job now of bringing light in through the skylights, and has a lobby that looks out to the canyon, which is something that this is a first example of kind of using the canyon as a backdrop, and sort of having the building work with a slope toward the canyon. Beluski goes on to work for Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And they are, if you've heard of them, they are still to this day the preeminent modernist architects. They are the international style. So the Pan Am building, which is now the MetLife building at the end of Madison Avenue in New York City, the Burj Khalifa, which I believe is still the tallest building in the world. We got Foster Schultz McNaughton, again, built on the cheap to address the needs of the dormitory needs in the 1950s. It's modernism. It's exactly what it says it was. There's almost no ornament except for a little bit of the brick to tie it in with the other buildings. Now, I make an argument that Foster Schultz Social Room should logically be the intellectual center of the college, since it combines Foster's progressivism with Schultz's concern with the life of the mind and the humanities program, but I've been told that that's kind of a silly idea. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill go on to design the science building, and they, again, a radical departure. They put blue enamel metal panels on the side, and it turns out that those conduct heat very well. And so the rooms heat up a lot. And they come back in the 1960s and they sort of neo-Gothicize them. That's Richard Ritz's, architectural historian Richard Ritz's term. What's neo-Gothic here? Well, the columns are vertical and they're brick. And you see again, that nicely variegated brick. Interestingly, the columns are hollow, and that's because they serve as ventilation pathways for the range hoods in biology. And then the enamel, the blue enamel has been changed to a sort of faux copper brown color, which ties in more with the other buildings. When we brought Docomomo, the Society for the Documentation and Conservation of Modern Architecture, which buildings do you think they liked best? Cross Canyon. Now here we have our first Reed architect, Neil Farnham, class of 40. These were built, Cross Canyon dorms were built also cheaply in the 1950s and early 60s. My first dorm, Sisson dorm, which no longer exists because Bragdon has taken its place. I lived in one of these, and it just, you had a sense of how cheap it was. Single pane windows. It was heated from the floor, which was nice, but the windows had bars in it, and you'd get crane flies in. It didn't have any screenings, so you get crane flies, and even ducks would come in in the rainy season. So there was some talk actually of tearing them down. What they do nicely, and even better now that they've redone the framing, or they've redone the window, they're now double pane windows and spruced them up a little bit. What it does nicely, again, is this Northwest style of architecture, Northwest regional style, which really does a good job of using the canyon as a backdrop, looking into the canyon and drawing in that light, mixing inside and outside. So as I recall, the decks run, there'll be an inside floor, and then it's repeated on the deck outside. And if nothing else, they remind a lot of us sort of nostalgically of mid-century ranch houses that some of us might have grown up in. So that takes us to postmodernism. The triangle is back. We could have probably longer discussions about what postmodernism is. I'm going to just point to two buildings here sort of as reference. One is Centre Pompidou in Paris in the 1970s. And modernism stripped away ornament, postmodernism brought it back playfully. And here, what's been brought back playfully are the utilities, the heating, ventilating, the HVAC on the outside of the building now, and painted in those bright colors. Postmodernism really came to Portland in 1983 with the Michael Graves Portland building. And here you see some classical motifs sort of quoted in terracotta, even sort of archly, but in these very 1980s pastel colors. And so that was, of course, a controversial and breathtaking building in its time. I have to say, at this point, I had a lot of people were very sick of the sort of steel and glass boxes that existed, and I see some argument in the chat. That's good. Please do. And so this seemed like a breath of fresh air. I mean, it just seemed like so many vistas were opening up. It may have come to Reed a little bit earlier, and let's look at Vallum for a second here, because we have some of that playfulness in even the choice of brick, a combination of the red brick, the normal sort of regular roll red brick, and these bluish clinker bricks, and that matches the blue, the painted utilities inside. Some of the heating and ventilation conduits are painted. Those pipes in front, I don't know that they serve any purpose, actually. I don't know if they're ventilation or they're just structural or just ornamental, but look at this. This is so 70s. You've got this Clarendon wide font that runs sideways. It's running sideways, and this wonderful spiral staircase. Here again, that cliff of trees is outside of this 2 or 2.5 story window is being used as a fourth wall here. And again, I think that brings in a lot of really lovely light. It adds a lot to the feeling of the building. I remember classes in there, you're kind of looking into the slope. So the building really does take advantage of the slope of the hill as it runs down to the canyon. The main period of of postmodernism, though, is really in the Zimmer-Gunzel-Frasca era. These are local architects. They're still sort of the house architects for Reed College. And there it is again. There's the false gable with its Corby stops and the nicely variegated brick. Instead of limestone, we've got painted or colored concrete, which to my mind doesn't quite weather as nicely. You can see there it's a little stained, but these triangles are everywhere. And at this time, it seemed exciting. And then they started showing up at Safeway and mini marts and so forth. And so those postmodern ornament, caught on pretty quickly and became pretty cliche. But originally, when they redid the library, or when they added a new wing to the library, there was a lot to recommend it. There was a lot just functionally, it made the library better and brought in more light. But there were a lot of really nice details that I think have held up some 30 years later. It's an actual slate roof. It's an actual stone roof. Those are actual copper dormers. Copper on the Elliott Hall, the original copper turns a Viridian green. Here it's been, it's probably an alloy. I think it has some surface coating, but it has a natural quality to it that, that ages well over the years. And you can see that the ZGF new wing of the library matches the false gables of the old wing of the library. And I mean, I guess if you grow up in the United Kingdom, where, I don't know, I assume that they have these on every street corner, right? But this must look like a tacky American ripoff. And probably it is. For me, it does evoke the history and that sense of connection to the past. And my sense of this is whether it works or not aesthetically, just in terms of my tastes, and your tastes may differ. I mean, you may find this very much a hegemonic expression of Western European dominance. And that seems to me a very equally valid aesthetic response to these buildings. To me, whether it works or not is very much about the use of natural materials, or just the quality of the materials in general. They don't have to be natural, but I think the limestone does a much better job of catching the light in different seasons, different times of the day. Obviously, the choice of brick, I think, makes a really big difference. Where it's more monotonous, it just feels cold. Whereas the variegation and the wide jointing makes a difference from 200 feet away in terms of the way the light hits it. The copper dormers and the slate roof, all of those things make an impression, and I think age very well. Okay, oh, here's another nice, this used to be the entrance, and it's been redone in limestone, which impresses me. It's also a lovely place to sit. Inside, they use the exterior of the old library as the interior or the atrium. They brought a lot of light in. It's a lovely space. They repurposed the gargoyles and brought them into the atrium. I think one of them is racist, but I'm not sure. And that brings us up to contemporary modernism, which I'm not sure how to characterize. We're back to the rectangle. We've lost the false gables. And the first real instance of this is the Performing Arts Building, which represents an amazing diplomatic achievement of bringing together dance and theater and dance, theater, and music. Well, not that they were at war, but just that they had been scattered to the four winds throughout campus, and really not given pride of place in the Reed curriculum to the extent that PAB intends to provide. This is again, we're not seeing the postmodernism. We're not seeing that playful use of ornament. We're seeing the rectangle. It's a little more austere, but maybe you could call it green modernism or sustainable modernism. The architect here is Opsis, with the performing arts spaces done by Fisher Dax. It has a bioswale and an eco roof. It has a sustainable wood acoustic wall with wood from a beloved fallen tree. It's it's not air conditioned in the way that, at least the central atrium, it's not air conditioned in the way that buildings usually are. It has automatic louvered climate control windows, and then the heating and cooling comes from the concrete floors. It has a 6-degree curve in the southern exposure to take advantage of the seasonal light. And it uses, with all that modernism, it still uses the Wilhelmina clay brick that was favored by Beluski. I think one of the biggest changes in thinking here It also has really good ADA accessibility. That's important, and it's closer to parking. But there's a sense in which Reed, after World War I, especially, financial it turned inward for both economic and political reasons, and sort of focused more on the front lawn and the quad and that sort of area. This is the first building that literally looks out into Portland and more offers Reed's performances to the public. And I think there are plans for expanding it eventually, and providing the space that's in call now will be in the Performing Arts Building. Also, beautiful use of light. Although I find I want to hear other people's opinions about it. I find the acoustics kind of spooky when you walk in. You sort of feel like you can hear what's across the room. I'd be curious to hear people's reactions who actually use the building for study. And then finally, the Trillium Dorm. Again, Zimmer Gunsel Frasca with Braulio Battista is the architect here. It's a platinum LEED certified building. It's got copper panels, which is really that's the only thing I see that ties it in with the other architecture. It's got floating foundations to make it safer in an earthquake. And it uses this variegated, this one-sided Roman brick. Well, bricks all have 6 sides, I mean, but this is a brick that has a preferred facing. And so it was quite difficult for the bricklayers, and I think they went through one set of bricklayers and found another, because it was quite difficult for them to apply. I'm very curious. I'm very curious how people respond to this building inside, and people who've lived in it especially. I don't know how I feel about the brick. I think this is another case where it'll be interesting to see how it ages, and how the building then sort of fits in with the rest of the landscape. So you saw the video at the beginning, and that was almost 2 years ago that I did that, and I put it up on YouTube, and it went out to alums. And I got on Facebook, John Sheehy, who's a Reed historian. He's a Reedy who's done the oral history called Comrades of the Quest. It's 3 inches thick. It's like the thickest book I've ever read, but it's oral history. So you can dip in any place, and it's very readable. Anyway, he reached out to me, says, interesting that you mentioned Woodrow Wilson, because Foster was a big fan of Woodrow Wilson, and especially shared values that are related to their interest in the eugenics movement. Oh, so that changes a little bit my narrative of Foster's progressivism, or makes it more interesting, depending. But John and I started doing some research on this, because we knew that John knew that Foster was the president of the Oregon Social Hygiene Society. And I'm not a historian of the period. You have people, some of you students may be working on this period, so please inform me. The connections between eugenics and the Nazi movement and so forth, I'm not an expert on. So I've done a little research at the Oregon Historical Society. I can say a little bit about this, but their main concern seemed to be sexuality, especially the concerns about sort of sexuality being expressed in the early part of the 20th century in movies and 4-color advertisements, and girls that smoke in the dorms and so forth. It's there's maybe a little bit of sort of paternalistic feminism, concern with women's rights, but it's more concerned about sexual activity and venereal diseases. It's kind of interesting to read, because they don't have the language of sexuality that comes from sexologists like Magnus Hirschfeld and Freud and feminism and the psychotherapeutic movement in the US. So they want to talk about sex. They feel it's really important, but at the same time, only the right people can, because it could be too salacious or arousing for young people. But they are very concerned. And my biggest concern in encountering this work was the connection at the time in Oregon between the eugenics movement and the sterilization bills that were passed. These monstrous bills were tragically resulted in the sterilization of several thousand prison inmates and mental patients over the next, this is the 20s, so the next 30 years or so. Then it was outlawed by the Skinner case in the Supreme Court in 48, but continued. I had a friend who was voluntarily, but under duress, sterilized. And this was still in the 80s. So this went on. And so I did look at that. And there's a thesis here. So I'm trying, this is my pitch, because I think there's more work to be done here. It does look to me like Foster's group was not involved in this, that they had other legislative priorities. Interestingly, the people who opposed it most were the anti-vaxxers, who have concern about government intervention in healthcare. What Foster did seem was really invested in and was really concerned with was seemed to have a personal concern about young men who were taken advantage of by quack doctors offering cures for venereal disease. So his main work, at least in the minutes of the society, is the Quackery Committee. He's the head of the Quackery Committee, and they're going after the Oregon Journal for the physicians who are the purveyors of these false medicines who are advertising. But they're also going after purveyors of Oriental medicine. And again, I think there's some work here. This would be a good thesis. There's probably more to be found in the archives of the Chinese Historical Society in Old Town. It looks like they were threatening suit against some of these purveyors of Oriental medicine, and maybe even brought law enforcement action against them. So it's an interesting history. It deserves, I think, for folks who are interested in seeing the connection between Oregon's racist past, starting with territorial, embedded in the Constitution and the presence of the KKK in the early 20th century, there's work here. For those who are interested in the progressive period, seeing some of the complexities of that. Anyway, that's the end of my pitch there. One way in which this might have affected the choice of architecture, at least must have made the choice of collegiate Gothic appealing to Foster, was that the original design of these medieval universities, Oxford and so forth, part of the reason you have a quad is you want to enclose this sort of monastic group of young men from the temptations of the town, this town gown separation. You want to keep them from drink and sexuality. So that may be one reason why this is a plan from before the college was built. Foster's original vision was to have Reed become this university. And so there would be this quad for economic and political reasons, never happened. And so the constraining of Reed students by architecture never actually occurred.